At 4:07 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in August 2015, a man walked through the door of the abandoned general store in Bodie, California. He was 32 years old, visiting from New Jersey with his wife and two children. The floorboards under his feet had not been replaced in more than 60 years. The wood was dry, cracked, and brittle from decades of high desert sun and freezing winter nights. He took 3 steps inside. The 4th step did not hold him. The floor gave way. He fell through the rotted timber into the basement below. The drop was roughly 12 feet. His wife heard the crack of breaking wood, then the thud. She ran to the door and looked down. He was conscious but unable to move. She called 911 at 4:09 p.m. The park rangers at Bodie State Historic Park responded immediately. They arrived at 4:14 p.m. Paramedics from Bridgeport were dispatched at 4:17 p.m. The nearest hospital was 35 miles away over winding mountain roads. The man was extracted from the basement at 4:28 p.m. He was airlifted by helicopter at 4:44 p.m. He was pronounced dead at the hospital at 5:52 p.m. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head and neck. The fall had fractured his cervical spine. What happened? The general store in Bodie is one of the most photographed buildings in the park. It stands on the main street, its false front still bearing faded paint and a nearly illegible sign. Inside, the shelves are lined with original merchandise. Canned goods from the 1880s, glass bottles of Pat medicine, wooden crates stamped with names of long-defunct companies. The floor is original pine laid in the 1870s when Bodie was a booming mining town with 10,000 residents. By the time the man stepped onto it, the building had been empty for nearly a century. The wood had not been treated or reinforced. It had simply been left to rot. Investigators from the California State Parks Department arrived the following morning. They examined the floor. They measured the thickness of the remaining timber. They found that the joists beneath the floorboards had rotted through completely in a 4-foot section near the entrance. The wood appeared solid from above. Below, it was dust. The park had no regular inspection schedule for the interior floors of its historic structures. The general store was cordoned off with a single rope at the door, but visitors routinely crossed it to take photographs. There was no warning sign on the floor itself. The man's family later filed a wrongful death claim against the state of California. The claim was settled for an undisclosed amount in 2007. The park installed new barriers and added explicit warnings at the entrance. But the deeper question remained: why do people walk into places like this at all? Why does a ghost town still pull someone from New Jersey across 3,000 miles to stand on a floor that could collapse? To understand that, you have to go back further. Bodie was founded in 1859 after gold was discovered in the nearby hills. By 1880, it was one of the largest cities in California. It had 65 saloons, a red light district, a Chinatown, dozens of stores, a railroad station, a school, a jail, and a newspaper called the Bodie Daily Free Press. It was lawless, violent, and rich. Then the gold ran out. By 1910, the population had dropped to a few hundred. By 1940, the last residents left. The town was abandoned to the elements, but it was never forgotten. In 1962, the state of California designated Bodie a state historic park. The policy was arrested decay. The buildings would not be restored or maintained beyond keeping them standing as they were. The intention was to freeze the town in time. That meant leaving everything exactly as it had been when the last door closed. Cans on shelves, beds unmade, tables set. The effect is uncanny. Walking through Bodie feels less like visiting a museum and more like stepping into a place where the people simply vanished, leaving their lives untouched. That is the pull. Ghost towns are not just ruins. They are frozen narratives. They offer a direct, unmediated encounter with a past that has no protective glass or velvet rope. You can touch a wooden counter where a miner bought whiskey in 1880. You can stand in the same spot where a schoolteacher wrote on a blackboard. The absence of people makes the presence of their objects more intimate, but that intimacy comes with risk. Buildings that have stood for 100 years without maintenance are not stable. Floors rot, walls lean, ceilings sag. The very authenticity that draws people in also makes the space dangerous. Investigators found that the floor in the Bodie General Store had not been inspected in the 10 years prior to the accident. There was no formal program for structural assessment of the interior of historic buildings in the park. The exterior was monitored for weather damage and erosion. But interior floors, stairs, and porches were considered low priority because the park's policy discouraged visitors from entering the buildings. In practice, visitors entered constantly. The rope at the door was a suggestion, not a barrier. The man's family argued that the state knew people entered the building and failed to take reasonable steps to warn them of the hazard. The park responded by installing waist-high gates at the entrances of all buildings with public access. They added signs with explicit warnings. They also began a phased inspection of all interior wooden floors, but the damage to the family was done. The man's wife said in an interview that he had always been fascinated by ghost towns. He had read about Bodie for years. When he finally got there, he wanted to see the general store because the photographs he had seen online showed shelves stocked with original goods. He thought it would be like walking into a time capsule. He was right. It was exactly that. He just did not know the capsule was collapsing. The accident in Bodie is not an isolated case. Across the American West, dozens of ghost towns draw hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Some are state parks like Bodie. Some are privately owned. Some are simply abandoned and unguarded. People hike, drive, or fly in to explore them. They take photographs, they climb stairs, they open doors. Sometimes they fall through floors. Sometimes they get lost in underground tunnels. Sometimes they disturb unstable walls and are buried, but the attraction persists. To understand why, you have to look at what ghost towns represent. They are not just old buildings. They are evidence of a cycle that is deeply American, the boom and the bust. The belief that wealth is just over the next ridge, the willingness to leave everything behind and start over, the sudden, violent end of a dream. Ghost towns are the physical remains of that story. They are monuments to ambition and failure in equal measure. The people who are pulled to them are not all thrill seekers or urban explorers. Many are ordinary tourists who want to see history preserved in a way that a restored museum cannot offer. They want the feeling of discovery. They want to stand where someone stood a century ago and imagine the life they lived. That desire is powerful. It overrides caution. It overrides the warnings. It overrides the instinct to stay safe. In the case of the man from New Jersey, his family said he had talked about visiting Bodie for years. He had seen it in a documentary. He had shown his children old photographs of the town. When they finally made the trip, it was a bucket list destination. He was not reckless. He was careful with his children. He held their hands. He made sure they did not touch anything fragile. He just did not see the danger in the floor. The investigation that followed found that the State Parks Department had no documented policy for interior inspection of historic buildings beyond visual checks from the doorway. Rangers were trained to look for graffiti, vandalism, and fire hazards. They were not trained to assess structural integrity from below. The floor that gave way had been walked on by thousands of visitors over the preceding decades. Each step weakened it a little more. No one measured the decay. No one sounded an alarm. The man's death raised broader questions about how the United States manages its ghost towns. Are they historical treasures or public liabilities? Should they be preserved exactly as they are, or should they be made safe at the cost of authenticity? There is no easy answer. Bodie's policy of arrested decay is intentional. It means the park does not replace original materials, it does not patch holes, it does not reinforce floors. The idea is that the building herself tells its own story even as it crumbles, but that story comes with a price. After the accident, the park installed gates and signs, but the gates are low. The signs are polite, visitors still step over them, they still walk in, they still take photographs. They still stand on the same floor, now patched with new lumber that is visible against the old boards. The patch is a scar. It reminds everyone what happened, but the building remains open to the public. The park could have sealed the general store permanently. It chose not to. The superintendent at the time said that closing the building would be like closing a chapter of history. The town is supposed to be alive even in its decay. That idea is at the heart of why America's ghost towns still pull people in. They are not dead, they are suspended. They exist in a state of slow disintegration that invites visitors to witness the passage of time directly. The floors are fragile, the walls are weak, the roofs leak. But that fragility is part of the experience. People want to see the place before it is gone. They want to touch a piece of the past before it turns to dust. This was not the first death in a ghost town. In 2013, a 24-year-old man exploring the abandoned mining town of Garnett, Montana, fell into a hidden mine shaft and died. In 2010, a woman in the ghost town of Rhyolite, Nevada, was bitten by a rattlesnake while walking through an old building. She survived but required hospitalization. In 2007, a group of teenagers exploring the ghost town of Calico, California, caused a partial wall collapse that injured one of them. Each incident brings a new round of discussion about safety. And each time the same answer emerges, the risk is part of the attraction, but the attraction is not simply about risk, it is about authenticity. Ghost towns offer something that no reconstructed historical village can match. They are real, the nails are original, the wood is original, the dust on the shelves is 100 years old. When you walk into a ghost town, you are walking into the actual past, not a replica, not a diorama. Not a simulation, the real thing, and the real thing is fragile. The man who died in Bodie understood that. He had photographed other ghost towns across the country. He had written about them on his travel blog. He described them as windows into a vanished America. He wanted his children to see them before they were gone. He did not know that staying there would be the last thing he ever saw. The state of California settled the lawsuit. The park made changes, but the general store still stands. Visitors still cross the threshold. The new sign at the entrance reads, "Warning, historic structure, unstable floors, enter at your own risk." The man from New Jersey never saw that sign. It was installed the week after he died. How could this have happened? The answer is layered. The failure was not just a floor that rotted. It was a system that assumed people would respect the rope. It was a visitation policy that prioritized authenticity over safety. It was a cultural fascination with abandoned places that overrides rational caution. And it was a simple, tragic miscalculation by a man who wanted to show his children a piece of history. He did not know the floor would not hold him. He did not know that the building he loved from photographs was slowly falling apart. He did not know that the ghost town was still pulling people in, not just with its beauty but with its danger. At 2:17 p.m. on the 23rd of August 2013, a young man named Caleb stepped off a gravel road in the Garnet Mountains of western Montana. He was 24 years old, an experienced hiker and amateur historian. He had driven 3 hours from Missoula with a single backpack, a camera, and a hand-drawn map of the Garnet ghost town. He had read about it in hiking forums. He had seen photographs of the abandoned general store, the log cabins, the stamp mill. He wanted to explore before the light faded. By 2:24 p.m., he had passed the main cluster of buildings. The town was unstaffed, unguarded, and largely unmaintained. The U.S. Forest Service managed the site, but no ranger was stationed on site. Visitors were free to wander. There were no gates, no ropes, no signs warning of hidden hazards. The only map available was a simple brochure at the trailhead that showed building names but nothing about underground workings. At 2:31 p.m., Caleb entered the woods behind the old assay office. The ground was uneven, covered with pine needles and fallen branches. He stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground. It was not. The soil gave way beneath his right foot. He fell headfirst into a vertical shaft that had been dug in the 1890s and then covered with a thin layer of dirt and brush. The shaft was 36 feet deep. At the bottom was 6 inches of stagnant water and loose rock. No one saw him fall. No one heard him call out. His phone had no signal in the remote canyon. He had not told anyone his exact route. The search began only when his family reported him missing 2 days later. By then, the weather had turned cold. A search team of volunteers and Forest Service personnel arrived on the 26th of August. They used a cadaver dog, a search camera on a pole, and a rope rescue harness. They found his camera near the shaft entrance. They lowered a rescuer into the shaft. Caleb's body was recovered at 4:47 p.m. The coroner ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and neck. The shaft was not marked on any official map. It had been dug by a single miner and later abandoned. No one had documented it. No one had sealed it. What happened in Garnet was not an isolated failure of maintenance. It was a failure of knowledge. The Forest Service estimated there were more than 6,000 abandoned mine shafts on its land in Montana alone. Most had never been surveyed, let alone capped. The agency relied on the public to stay aware, to stay on marked trails, to assume that every patch of ground might be a hollow space underground. But visitors assumed the opposite. They assumed that if a place was open to the public, it was safe. Caleb's family sued the federal government in 2005. The case settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. The Forest Service agreed to conduct a more thorough survey of the Garnet area and install warning signs at the trailhead. But by then, the shaft was already capped. It took a death to mark the spot. The Garnet ghost town is not unique. Across the American West, hundreds of ghost towns sit on public land with no active oversight. Some are administered by the Bureau of Land Management, some by the Forest Service, some by state parks, some by private owners. The level of safety depends on the budget, the staffing, and the legal exposure of the managing entity. In many cases, the cost of making an entire ghost town safe is far greater than the revenue generated by visitors, so the approach is often reactive. A building collapses, a visitor is injured, a lawsuit is filed, then a fix is applied. But the next ghost town 5 miles away remains unchanged. The draw of these places is not diminished by the danger. If anything, the danger is part of the allure. Online forums dedicated to ghost town exploration list the risks alongside the rewards. They warn about unstable floors, open shafts, falling beams, rattlesnakes, black widows, hantavirus, and the risk of arrest on private property. The warnings are ignored. Comment sections fill with stories of close calls, broken ankles, and hours spent trapped in basements. The next post is always a plan for another trip. Why? Because ghost towns offer a kind of time travel that no museum can replicate. In a museum, artifacts are arranged in glass cases. The lighting is controlled. The temperature is controlled. The context is sanitized. In a ghost town, the artifact is the building. The artifact is the dust on the floor. The artifact is the rusted bed frame still sitting where someone left it in 1900. The experience is raw, unmediated, and irreplaceable. People who visit ghost towns often describe a feeling of walking through a photograph. The silence is different. The air smells different. The light filters through broken windows in a way that seems intentional. The mind fills in the gaps. You imagine the sound of boots on a boardwalk. You imagine the clatter of a stamp mill. You imagine a child running through the street. The story becomes your own. But that story is built on neglect. The same neglect that preserves the patina also weakens the structure. The rain that leaks through a roof in 1911 is the same rain that rots the floor in 2008. The frost that cracks a foundation in 1905 is the same frost that topples a wall in 2008. Ghost towns do not hold still. They decay at a rate determined by climate, biology, and time. The visitor who steps inside is stepping into a process that began the day the last person left. In Bodie, the process is called arrested decay. It means no restoration, no reinforcement, no replacement. The park's mission is to preserve the town as it was when the last residents abandoned it. That mission includes the risk. The park acknowledges that every building will eventually collapse. They accept that the public enters at their own risk. They accept that some visitors may be injured or killed. The trade-off is authenticity. In Garnet, there is no official preservation philosophy. The town is managed as a historic site but with minimal intervention. The Forest Service's priority is public safety, not historical integrity. But they lack the funds to survey every shaft and reinforce every floor, so the town exists in a gray zone. It is open, it is advertised, it is visited, but it is not safe. How could this have happened to Caleb the same way it happened to the man in Bodie? He trusted the ground. He trusted that a place open to the public had been inspected. He trusted that the stories he read online did not mention hidden shafts. He trusted that the grass covered solid rock. He was wrong. The systems that are supposed to protect visitors to ghost towns are inconsistent and underfunded. There is no national standard for ghost town safety. Each managing body decides its own policy. Some post warnings, some do not, some install gates, some do not, some hire rangers, some rely on self-policing. The result is a patchwork of risk that depends entirely on where you go. In California, after the Bodie incident, the state park system reviewed its inspection protocols. But the review did not apply to other states. In Montana, after the Garnet incident, the Forest Service installed a few new signs but did not fund a statewide mine shaft survey. In Nevada, after the rhyolite snakebite in 2010, the park added a notice at the visitor center but did not change entry rules. Each incident produces a local response. Each response is reactive. The next state over remains unchanged. The human cost is not limited to death. In 2015, a woman in the ghost town of St. Elmo, Colorado, broke her leg when a wooden porch collapsed beneath her. She was alone. It took 4 hours for another hiker to find her and call for help. The rescue required a helicopter because the road was impassable. Her medical bills exceeded $50,000. She later said she would not sue. She knew the risk. She said she just wanted to see the town before it was gone. In 2017, a father and son in the ghost town of Shenandoah, Oregon, were exploring a collapsed barn when the son stepped on a rusted nail that went through his boot. The nail carried tetanus. The boy was hospitalized for 5 days. The father said in an interview that he had assumed the barn was stable because it was still standing. He said he did not see the nails hidden under the hay. In 2019, a group of 3 men in the ghost town of Animas Forks, Colorado, entered a mine adit that was not marked as hazardous. The adit ran 200 feet into the mountain. Inside, the air was heavy with carbon dioxide. One man collapsed, the others dragged him out. He survived but required oxygen. The adit was later sealed by the Bureau of Land Management, but only after the incident made the news. Each of these stories follows a pattern. A visitor arrives with curiosity and a sense of adventure. They see a building, they enter, they assume the ground is solid, they assume the air is breathable, they assume the ceiling will hold. They are wrong. The building or the ground fails, someone is injured or killed, the site is modified, the news cycle moves on, the next visitor arrives the following weekend. What pulls them in? The answer is not simple. It is not just the danger, it is not just the history, it is the combination. Ghost towns offer a tangible connection to a past that is always slipping away. They offer a physical encounter with a narrative that is otherwise confined to textbooks and photographs. They offer a moment of solitude in a place that was once full of noise. They offer a chance to touch the frontier even if the frontier is rotten. The man from New Jersey wanted that. Caleb wanted that. The woman in St. Elmo wanted that. They all understood the attraction. What they did not understand is that the attraction carries a cost. The ghost town does not distinguish between a visitor and a victim. It treats both the same. It lets them enter. It lets them explore. And if the floor gives way or the shaft opens, it takes them. The question that remains unanswered is whether the American system of managing ghost towns can ever be made safe without destroying what makes them valuable. If every floor is reinforced, every shaft is capped, every wall is braced, then the ghost town becomes a staged replica. It loses the authenticity that drew people in the first place. If nothing is done, the death toll will rise. The tension between preservation and public safety is not new, but it is unresolved. The families of the dead do not have an easy answer either. They want accountability. They want change. But they also understand why their loved ones went. They say the same thing: they were happy, they were following a passion, they were doing what they loved. The tragedy is that the passion outran the hazard. The ghost towns of America will continue to pull people in. The doors will remain open, the floors will continue to rot, the shafts will remain hidden under grass, the signs will be ignored, the risk will be accepted. And every year someone will not come home. The only question is who will be next. The answer came on a cool morning in October of 2012. At 8:45 a.m., a woman named Diane parked her sedan on the gravel pullout outside the ghost town of Thurmond, West Virginia. She had driven 6 hours from Pittsburgh. Her plan was simple: walk the main street, photograph the old railroad depot, and be home by evening. Thurmond is one of the few ghost towns still reachable by active rail. The CSX mainline runs alongside the abandoned storefronts. Diane had researched the town online. She knew the depot was restored. She knew the rest of the town was crumbling. She had seen warnings online about unstable floors and unguarded wells. She thought she understood the risk. At 9:10 a.m., she stepped through the open doorway of what had once been a dry goods store. The floorboards were dark with decades of moisture. The ceiling sagged in the center. Diane lifted her camera. She took 3 steps forward. The floor did not groan. It simply gave way. She fell through the rotted wood into a cellar she did not know existed. The drop was 12 feet. She landed on a concrete floor littered with broken glass and rusted cans. Her left ankle shattered on impact. Her phone landed somewhere in the dark. She lay there for nearly 2 hours before another visitor heard her calling. That visitor, a retired coal miner named Roy, did not have a phone signal either. He drove back to the nearest town, which was 18 miles away, to call the county sheriff. The rescue team arrived at 12:30 p.m. They used a ladder and a rope harness to pull Diane out. She was airlifted to a hospital in Beckley. Surgery followed. She walked with a limp after. She later told a reporter, "I saw the warning online, but I thought it meant the roof, not the floor." Diane sued the county for negligence. The suit argued that the county owned the building and had a duty to inspect or seal it. The county countered that Thurmond was not a park, not a maintained historic site, and that the building had been posted with a no trespassing sign, though that sign had faded and was partially obscured by kudzu. The case was settled out of court for $50,000, no admission of fault, no structural changes. The building remains open today. That pattern repeats across the country. The legal system treats ghost towns as a kind of no man's land. If the land is private, the owner can be sued, but many owners are untraceable or bankrupt. If the land is public, the government entity can be sued, but sovereign immunity often limits damages. The result is a legal gray area that protects no one. The injured are left with medical bills and no clear path to accountability. The sites remain accessible. The risk remains unchanged. What happened in Thurmond? The same thing that happened in Bodie, Garnet, Rhyolite, St. Elmo, Shaniko, and Animas Forks. A person arrived curious. A person entered a structure. A person assumed the structure would hold. The structure failed. The person was hurt. The system responded after the fact, not before. The question that lingers is whether the American approach to ghost towns is inherently broken. The scale of the problem is larger than most people realize. The United States contains an estimated 10,000 ghost towns. That number is imprecise because there is no official definition. Some are single buildings in a field. Some are entire collapsed boomtowns with hundreds of structures. Some are preserved by state parks. Some are completely unmarked. The vast majority, perhaps 80%, are on public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, or state agencies. None of those agencies have a dedicated budget for ghost town safety. The Bureau of Land Management oversees 245 million acres. Its annual budget for cultural resource management, which includes all historic sites, is approximately $15 million. That works out to about 6 cents per acre. The Forest Service manages 193 million acres with a similar funding structure. Neither agency has the resources to inspect every ghost town, let alone stabilize every collapsing structure. They prioritize the most visited sites. The rest are left to decay. That prioritization creates a hierarchy of risk. The most famous ghost towns, Bodie, Garnet, St. Elmo, Calico, Terlingua, receive regular oversight. Rangers patrol, signs are posted, shafts are capped. But the second-tier ghost towns, places like Vulture City, Arizona, or Collinsville, California, receive inspection only when someone complains or dies. The third-tier ghost towns, the abandoned mining camps buried in national forests, receive no inspection at all. No signs, no gates, no warnings. They are simply there waiting for the next visitor to open a door that should have been locked. Consider the case of Vulture City, an abandoned mining camp near Wickenburg, Arizona. In 2010, a man named Victor from Phoenix drove out on a dirt road after reading about the site online. He was an experienced hiker and had visited several ghost towns before. Vulture City had no official management. The land was a mix of private claims and Bureau of Land Management parcels. There were no signs, no restrooms, no parking lot. Victor parked on the shoulder and walked in. He found the main stamp mill, a 3-story timber structure with a collapsed roof. He wanted to see the interior. He entered through a gap in the wall where boards had been torn away. Inside, the floor was covered in debris. He climbed a staircase that seemed solid but was held together only by rusted nails. On the 3rd step, the entire staircase pulled away from the wall. He fell backward onto a pile of broken concrete below. He fractured his pelvis and 3 ribs. He lay in the dust for 6 hours before another group of explorers found him. They carried him out on a piece of plywood. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital. After the incident, the Bureau of Land Management posted a closure notice on its website. They said the site was dangerous and not recommended. But they did not install a physical barrier. They did not remove the collapsing buildings. They did not mark the trail. The site remained accessible because the closure notice was only a web page. Victor's lawyer argued that the Bureau had a duty to warn, but the case was dismissed on grounds of sovereign immunity. Victor was left with $120,000 in medical debt. In 2015, a woman named Carla from Portland visited the ghost town of Flora del, Oregon. Flora del is a tiny settlement in the Coast Range, abandoned since the 1920s. There are no signs, there is no parking. The road is a dead-end gravel track that ends at a creek crossing. Carla had found the location on an online forum for urban explorers. She wanted to photograph the remains of a sawmill. She stepped off the road onto a patch of ground that appeared solid. It was covering a root cellar that had collapsed inward. She fell 12 feet and broke her collarbone. Her partner had to hike 2 miles to get phone reception. The rescue took over 4 hours. She later said she never saw a warning because there was no warning to see. These stories share a common thread. The victims are not reckless thrill seekers. They are people with a genuine interest in history. They read, they study, they plan. But their research does not include a risk assessment because the risk is invisible. The ground looks solid. The staircase looks intact. The building looks like it has stood for 100 years, so why would it collapse today? The answer lies in the physics of decay. Wood rots from the inside out. A beam that appears sound at the surface may be honeycombed with dry rot and termite damage. The structural integrity of a ghost town is not visible to the naked eye. It can only be assessed by a trained professional using probes, moisture meters, and load tests. No visitor has that equipment. No visitor is trained to interpret the subtle signs of imminent failure. Every step is a gamble. The gamble is compounded by the fact that ghost towns are not static. They change with the weather. A dry year may stabilize a floor. A wet year may rot it through. A freeze-thaw cycle can crack a foundation overnight. A windstorm can loosen a wall. The building that stood safely in July may collapse in December. The visitor who arrives in spring steps on ground that was solid in autumn, but now it is not. How could the system prevent these tragedies? The simplest answer is closure. Seal every abandoned building. Cap every mine shaft. Post guards at every entry. But that approach is impractical, expensive, and deeply unpopular among the thousands of people who visit ghost towns each year. Many of those visitors are not merely tourists. They are part of a subculture that values the undiscovered quality of unmanaged sites. They share coordinates on forums, they swap stories, they have a name for themselves, ghost towners. The ghost towner community is informal but passionate. They maintain databases, they organize expeditions, they lobby for preservation but against overregulation. They argue that sealing buildings destroys the experience. They argue that visitors should accept responsibility for their own safety. They argue that the government should focus on education rather than enforcement. Their position is not unreasonable, but it runs directly into the reality that education does not prevent a rotting floor from breaking. One ghost towner, a retired engineer from Colorado named Tom, runs a website that catalogs over 3,000 ghost towns. He includes hazard ratings for each site. He warns about unstable floors, unguarded shafts, and aggressive wildlife. He also says that his ratings are based on his own observations and user reports, not on professional inspections. He cannot guarantee accuracy. He cannot update every site every year. He knows that some sites change between his visits. He still posts the ratings because he believes that information is better than nothing. Tom's approach represents the current state of ghost town safety, a patchwork of amateur warnings, inconsistent government oversight, and personal responsibility. It works most of the time. Most visitors leave unharmed, but the margin of error is thin. The consequences of a mistake are severe, and the system has no mechanism for catching errors before they happen. In 2023, a team of engineers from the University of Arizona proposed a solution. They suggested using drones equipped with thermal imaging and LiDAR to survey ghost towns and automatically identify structural weaknesses. The drones could map floor thickness, detect voids, and measure roof deflection. The data could be processed by artificial intelligence to generate risk scores. The scores could be posted online and updated annually. The cost per site was estimated at $500 per survey, far less than a full physical inspection. The proposal received funding for a pilot program in 3 ghost towns in Arizona. The results were promising. The drones identified 37 structural hazards that had not been previously documented. Among them was a floor in the town of Ruby that appeared solid but was only half an inch thick at the center. The ground beneath it was a collapsed cistern. A single step would have sent anyone through. The hazard was reported to the Bureau of Land Management. The building was fenced, but the pilot program ended after 1 year. The funding was not renewed. The drones sat in storage. The Bureau said that while the technology worked, they lacked the staff to process the data or follow up on the findings. The program was considered a success, but it was not scalable. The problem returned to the status quo. The real question is not technical, it is cultural. America has a complicated relationship with its abandoned past. Ghost towns represent failure, loss, and the harsh reality of boom-and-bust economy. They are reminders that the frontier was not a victory march. It was a series of bankruptcies, deaths, and departures. To seal them off is to admit that the past is dangerous. To leave them open is to accept that people will die. The compromise that has emerged is unspoken. The government keeps the most famous sites safe. The community manages the rest through word of mouth and personal judgment. The deaths are treated as isolated accidents rather than systemic failures. The warnings are added after the fact. The cycles continue. The only question is who will be next, and the answer keeps changing. In 2024, a man from Texas named Aaron was exploring the ghost town of Sharpsburg, Nevada, when he stepped on a board that gave way beneath him. He fell into a shallow but narrow hole, an abandoned well that had been covered by a rotting piece of plywood, then hidden by a layer of dirt and grass. The well was only 15 feet deep, but he landed awkwardly and broke his femur. He was alone. He had no cell signal. He screamed for 3 hours before a hiker on a ridge heard him. The rescue team extracted him by rope. He underwent surgery and spent 6 weeks recovering at his parents' home. He later told a local reporter, "I knew it was dangerous. I went anyway. I thought I was smarter than the hole." He was not the first to think that. He will not be the last. On the morning of August 13, 2019, 4 hikers entered the abandoned mining area surrounding Bodie, California. Bodie is a well-known ghost town, but the part preserved as a state park is only a fraction of the original settlement. Outside the park boundary, the landscape is pocked with hundreds of unmarked mine shafts, collapsed tunnels, and rotting headframes. The hikers were not on a marked trail. They had found a route described on a forum that led to a shaft known as the Mountain View opening. The post claimed the shaft was partially collapsed but still had a visible ladder. The hikers wanted to photograph the ladder. At 9:30 in the morning, they reached the coordinates. The ground was uneven, covered in sagebrush and loose rock. One of the hikers, a woman named Elise, stepped onto what looked like a flat patch of dirt. It was not. It was the edge of a hidden void, a secondary opening created by a collapse of the main shaft wall. The dirt gave way and she fell. She dropped approximately 20 feet before her fall was stopped by a ledge of broken timber and rock. She was conscious but trapped. Her companions could not see her. They called out. She responded. They called 911. Emergency services from Mono County responded. The terrain made it difficult to reach the site. A helicopter was dispatched but could not land nearby. Rescuers had to hike in with ropes, harnesses, and a stretcher. By the time they reached Elise, she had been in the shaft for nearly 2 hours. Her leg was broken. She had cuts on her face and arms. The rescuers stabilized her, rigged a pulley system, and hoisted her out. The entire operation took 4.5 hours. She was flown to a hospital in Reno. What happened in Bodie that day was not an anomaly. It was a repeat of a pattern that had been documented for decades. The area around Bodie contains an estimated 400 mine shafts, most of which are unrecorded on any official map. Many are concealed by vegetation, collapsed debris, or simply the passage of time. The California Department of Conservation has a program to cap abandoned mines, but funding is limited. As of 2019, only about a third of the known shafts in the Bodie Hills had been secured. The rest remained open, unmarked, and invisible to the untrained eye. The 4 hikers had not entered the state park. They had accessed public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The BLM had posted warning signs at the perimeter road. The signs said, "Danger, abandoned mines, enter at your own risk." But the signs were 2 miles away from the actual shaft. The hikers had parked at a pullout and walked past the sign without reading it carefully. They assumed the warning applied to the immediate vicinity, not to the entire hillside. That assumption was wrong. Investigators later reviewed the forum post that had guided the hikers. The post included photos of the ladder, but it did not mention the secondary opening. The poster had visited the site 3 years earlier. In that time, winter snow and spring runoff had eroded the ground around the main shaft, creating the void that Elise stepped into. The hazard had not existed when the post was written. It developed silently, underground, without any visible sign on the surface. This is the fundamental problem with ghost towns and abandoned mining sites. The danger is not static. It evolves with weather, time, and neglect. A site that is safe 1 year can become lethal the next. The information that explorers rely on, forum posts, guidebooks, old maps, is always out of date. The gap between the last observation and the present condition is where accidents happen. The question that follows is why people continue to seek these places despite the known risks. The answer is layered. Ghost towns are not merely abandoned buildings. They are physical remnants of a national story. The mining booms of the 19th century drew hundreds of thousands of people to the West. They built towns overnight: saloons, hotels, churches, schools. Within a decade, many of those towns were empty. The ore ran out, the railroad moved on, the people left. What remained were structures that seemed to hold time and place. Walking through a ghost town feels like stepping into a photograph. The floors still creak. The windows are still broken. The newspapers on the wall are dated 1885. The experience is immersive in a way that a museum cannot replicate. That immersive quality is what draws visitors, but it also creates a false sense of safety. The buildings look old, but they look solid. The floors are dusty but appear to bear weight. The stairs are worn but seem climbable. The visitor's brain makes an unconscious calculation. This building has stood for 100 years, so it can stand for another hour. That calculation ignores the fact that the building has not been maintained. Every rainstorm, every freeze, every insect infestation weakens the structure incrementally. The 100-year survival is not a guarantee of continued survival. It is a countdown. In 2016, a structural engineer named Dr. Helen Park conducted a study of abandoned buildings in the American West. She examined 43 structures across 5 states, all of which were considered standing and safe by local historical societies. Her team used ground-penetrating radar, moisture sensors, and core sampling to assess actual integrity. The results were sobering. Nearly 70% of the buildings had at least one structural element that was within 20% of failure. 12% had elements that were actively failing but had not yet collapsed. The failures were concentrated in floors, stairs, and roof supports, precisely the areas that visitors use most. Dr. Park's study was published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it received little attention outside academic circles. The historical societies did not change their recommendations. The ghost towner forums did not update their hazard ratings. The study sat on a shelf. The reason was not malice. It was money. Sealing or demolishing a historic building is expensive. The cost ranges from $10,000 for a small shack to over $100,000 for a large hotel. Most ghost towns are on public land, and the agencies that manage them, the BLM, the Forest Service, state parks, have limited budgets. They prioritize high-traffic sites. The remote towns get ignored. The result is a landscape of unmanaged risk. The risk is not distributed evenly. Some ghost towns are well-maintained. Bodie State Historic Park, for example, has a dedicated staff that inspects buildings regularly and closes off areas that are unsafe. But the vast majority of ghost towns have no oversight. They sit on land that is accessible to anyone with a vehicle and a map. The government knows they are dangerous. The visitors know they are dangerous, but neither side has the resources or the will to stop the cycle. In 2021, the state of Nevada attempted to address the problem with a public awareness campaign. They produced a video series called Don't Be a Ghost that showed dramatic reenactments of mine shaft falls and building collapses. The videos were posted on YouTube and shared on social media. The campaign was praised for its production quality, but its impact was difficult to measure. The number of rescues in abandoned mines did not decrease in the following year. In fact, it increased slightly. The reason, according to search and rescue officials, was that the videos had actually increased interest in ghost towns. People watched the videos, felt a thrill, and then went looking for the sites featured. This unintended consequence points to a deeper truth. The danger of ghost towns is part of their appeal. The possibility of injury, the risk of getting lost, the proximity to death, these elements transform a historical site into an adventure. For some visitors, the risk is not a deterrent. It is the point. That mindset is not new. It has roots in the American frontier myth. The pioneers who crossed the continent accepted tremendous risk. They died from disease, accidents, and violence, but their survival is celebrated as a triumph of courage and self-reliance. The ghost town is a monument to that risk. To enter it is to touch that history. To survive it is to prove something, if only to oneself. The problem is that the risk is not romantic. It is mechanical. A board rots, a wall shifts, a rock dislodges. There is no heroism in a broken femur. There is no lesson in a fall into a hole. The only outcome is pain, medical bills, and sometimes death. In 2022, a young man named David visited the ghost town of Chloride, Arizona. Chloride is one of the better preserved ghost towns in the state, and it has a small population of year-round residents. David was not interested in the inhabited part. He had heard about an old silver mine above the town known as the Monte Cristo. He hiked up the canyon alone. He found the entrance, which was gated, but the gate had been pried open. He entered. He did not have a headlamp. He used his phone flashlight. He walked about 50 feet into the tunnel. The floor was uneven. He tripped on a rock and dropped his phone. In the darkness, he could not find it. He tried to retrace his steps but became disoriented. He was lost. He spent 7 hours in the mine. His phone battery died. He screamed until his voice gave out. He eventually found a faint light from a crack in the ceiling. The crack was too narrow to climb through, but he could see the sky. He used his hands to scrape at the rock and dirt around the crack, widening it over several hours. He emerged at dawn the next day, covered in cuts and bruises. He had lost 8 pounds from dehydration. He was found by a hiker who called for help. David later told a reporter, "I thought I was careful. I thought I knew what I was doing. I didn't." David's story is not unusual. The National Cave Rescue Commission estimates that there are between 50 and 100 mine-related rescues in the United States each year. The number is likely an undercount because many incidents are not reported. Victims are often embarrassed. They do not want to face fines or legal consequences. They simply leave and never tell anyone. The consequence of this silence is that the true scope of the danger remains hidden. The public hears about dramatic rescues, but not about the dozens of close calls that happen every month. The forums continue to post glowing descriptions of unexplored sites. The warnings are buried in comment sections or ignored entirely. The question of who is responsible is unresolved. The landowners, federal and state agencies argue that they have posted warnings. They argue that visitors assume the risk. The visitors argue that warning signs are not enough. They argue that the government should either secure the sites or close them. The legal system has been tested in several cases. In 2017, a man named Robert sued the U.S. Forest Service after he fell through a floor in an abandoned cabin in Idaho. He claimed the Forest Service had a duty to inspect and maintain the structure. The court ruled against him, citing the recreational use statute, which limits liability for landowners who allow public access to undeveloped land. The ruling was upheld on appeal. Robert was left with $120,000 in medical debt. The legal framework is clear. The government is not responsible. The visitor is responsible. But that framework assumes that the visitor can assess the risk. As we have seen, that assumption is flawed. The risk is invisible. The information is outdated. The visitor's judgment is clouded by the same psychological factors that make ghost towns compelling. In 2015, a woman named Carla from Portland visited the ghost town of Flora Del, Oregon. Flora Del is a tiny settlement in the Coast Range, abandoned since the 1920s. There are no signs, there is no parking. The road is a dead-end gravel track that ends at a creek crossing. Carla had found the location on an online forum for urban explorers. She wanted to photograph the remains of a sawmill. She stepped off the road onto a patch of ground that appeared solid. It was covering a root cellar that had collapsed inward. She fell 12 feet and broke her collarbone. Her partner had to hike 2 miles to get phone reception. The rescue took over 4 hours. She later said she never saw a warning because there was no warning to see. These stories share a common thread. The victims are not reckless thrill seekers. They are people with a genuine interest in history. They read, they study, they plan. But their research does not include a risk assessment because the risk is invisible. The ground looks solid. The staircase looks intact. The building looks like it has stood for 100 years, so why would it collapse today? The answer lies in the physics of decay. Wood rots from the inside out. A beam that appears sound at the surface may be honeycombed with dry rot and termite damage. The structural integrity of a ghost town is not visible to the naked eye. It can only be assessed by a trained professional using probes, moisture meters, and load tests. No visitor has that equipment. No visitor is trained to interpret the subtle signs of imminent failure. Every step is a gamble. The gamble is compounded by the fact that ghost towns are not static. They change with the weather. A dry year may stabilize a floor. A wet year may rot it through. A freeze-thaw cycle can crack a foundation overnight. A windstorm can loosen a wall. The building that stood safely in July may collapse in December. The visitor who arrives in spring steps on ground that was solid in autumn, but now it is not. How could the system prevent these tragedies? The simplest answer is closure. Seal every abandoned building. Cap every mine shaft. Post guards at every entry. But that approach is impractical, expensive, and deeply unpopular among the thousands of people who visit ghost towns each year. Many of those visitors are not merely tourists. They are part of a subculture that values the undiscovered quality of unmanaged sites. They share coordinates on forums. They swap stories. They have a name for themselves: ghost towners. The ghost towner community is informal but passionate. They maintain databases. They organize expeditions. They lobby for preservation but against overregulation. They argue that sealing buildings destroys the experience. They argue that visitors should accept responsibility for their own safety. They argue that the government should focus on education rather than enforcement. Their position is not unreasonable, but it runs directly into the reality that education does not prevent a rotting floor from breaking. One ghost towner, a retired engineer from Colorado named Tom, runs a website that catalogs over 3,000 ghost towns. He includes hazard ratings for each site. He warns about unstable floors, unguarded shafts, and aggressive wildlife. He also says that his ratings are based on his own observations and user reports, not on professional inspections. He cannot guarantee accuracy. He cannot update every site every year. He knows that some sites change between his visits. He still posts the ratings because he believes that information is better than nothing. Tom's approach represents the current state of ghost town safety, a patchwork of amateur warnings, inconsistent government oversight, and personal responsibility. It works most of the time. Most visitors leave unharmed, but the margin of error is thin. The consequences of a mistake are severe, and the system has no mechanism for catching errors before they happen. In 2023, a team of engineers from the University of Arizona proposed a solution. They suggested using drones equipped with thermal imaging and LiDAR to survey ghost towns and automatically identify structural weaknesses. The drones could map floor thickness, detect voids, and measure roof deflection. The data could be processed by artificial intelligence to generate risk scores. The scores could be posted online and updated annually. The cost per site was estimated at $500 per survey, far less than a full physical inspection. The proposal received funding for a pilot program in 3 ghost towns in Arizona. The results were promising. The drones identified 37 structural hazards that had not been previously documented. Among them was a floor in the town of Ruby that appeared solid but was only half an inch thick at the center. The ground beneath it was a collapsed cistern. A single step would have sent anyone through. The hazard was reported to the Bureau of Land Management. The building was fenced, But the pilot program ended after 1 year. The funding was not renewed. The drones sat in storage. The Bureau said that while the technology worked, they lacked the staff to process the data or follow up on the findings. The program was considered a success, but it was not scalable. The problem returned to the status quo. The real question is not technical, it is cultural. America has a complicated relationship with its abandoned past. Ghost towns represent failure, loss, and the harsh reality of boom-and-bust economy. They are reminders that the frontier was not a victory march, it was a series of bankruptcies, deaths, and departures. To seal them off is to admit that the past is dangerous. To leave them open is to accept that people will die. The compromise that has emerged is unspoken. The government keeps the most famous sites safe. The community manages the rest through word of mouth and personal judgment. The deaths are treated as isolated accidents rather than systemic failures. The warnings are added after the fact. The cycles continue. The only question is who will be next, and the answer keeps changing. In 2024, a man from Texas named Aaron was exploring the ghost town of Sharpsburg, Nevada, when he stepped on a board that gave way beneath him. He fell into a shallow but narrow hole, an abandoned well that had been covered by a rotting piece of plywood, then hidden by a layer of dirt and grass. The well was only 15 feet deep, but he landed awkwardly and broke his femur. He was alone. He had no cell signal. He screamed for 3 hours before a hiker on a ridge heard him. The rescue team extracted him by rope. He underwent surgery and spent 6 weeks recovering at his parents' home. He later told a local reporter, "I knew it was dangerous. I went anyway. I thought I was smarter than the whole." He was not the first to think that. He will not be the last. In March of 2025, the National Park Service released a report on visitor fatalities in abandoned mining districts. The report covered incidents between 2010 and 2024. It found 37 confirmed deaths directly related to structural collapses, falls into shafts, or entrapment in tunnels. The true number was likely higher because many deaths in remote areas are attributed to exposure or undetermined causes. The report noted that the majority of victims were men between the ages of 25 and 40. They were not drunk, they were not reckless, they were experienced outdoorsmen, they simply misjudged the ground. One case stood out. In June of 2022, a man named James visited the ghost town of St. Elmo, Colorado. St. Elmo is one of the most popular ghost towns in the state, with a well-maintained main street and a historic general store. James did not stay on the main street. He hiked up a side canyon to an old stamp mill. He wanted to see the machinery. The trail was faint but marked with cairns. He reached the mill. The structure was leaning. He entered through a broken window. Inside, the floor had partially collapsed. He stepped onto a remaining section and it gave way. He fell into the basement, which was filled with debris. He was found 2 days later by another hiker. He had died from head trauma. His death was ruled accidental. The local historical society, which manages St. Elmo, had not posted warnings at the mill. They considered it part of the natural setting and assumed visitors would know it was dangerous. After James's death, they added a fence and a sign. The sign said, "Historic structure unstable, do not enter." The sign was a late addition. It did not bring James back, but it may prevent the next death. That is the pattern, a tragedy then a reaction. The reaction is always after the fact. Some argue that this reactive approach is better than nothing. Others argue that it is a failure of responsibility. The ghost towns are public assets. They are part of the national heritage. To let them kill people is not just tragic, it is avoidable. In 2026, a coalition of nonprofit preservation groups and outdoor recreation organizations began pushing for a federal Ghost Town Safety Act. The proposed legislation would allocate funds for drone surveys, structural assessments, and site hardening. It would require all agencies managing abandoned mining towns to post digital hazard maps accessible by smartphone. It would create a centralized database of known risks, updated quarterly. It would also establish a voluntary certification program for ghost town visitors, teaching basic hazard recognition. The bill has not passed. It faces opposition from property rights advocates who argue that it expands government oversight. It faces budget constraints. It faces the simple reality that ghost towns are not a priority for most Americans. They are a niche interest. Their victims are a handful of people each year. The deaths do not generate national headlines. The pressure to act is low. And so the cycle continues. Every spring, the thaw reveals new holes. Every summer, the visitors arrive. Every autumn, the accidents are recorded. Every winter, the reports are written. The ground shifts, the wood rots, the wells yawn open. The ghost towns pull people in. They always have, they always will. The question is whether we choose to see the risk or whether we wait for the next fall.